Voting across the country is already well underway in some states, and both candidates are looking to tap into what's set to be the nation's largest minority voting bloc. In battleground states like Florida, President Trump and former Vice President Joe Biden are looking to Latinos to help swing the results in their favor. Biden has struggled to gain support from Latinos compared to Hillary Clinton in 2016, but President Trump may be able to keep his support steady at about 30%. With me now for more on her reporting is Andrea González-Ramírez. She is a senior writer for Jen by Medium. Good to see you.
Hi, Vlad.
So, Andrea, let's start with Latinos for Trump. How have they become a stronghold group for the GOP, and why are they important to gaining more Latino support for Republicans?
Yeah, so about 30% of Latinos have historically voted for the Republican presidential candidate since Richard Nixon's reelection in 1972. President Trump gained about 28% of Latinos in 2016. And, despite his incendiary rhetoric, he's not the worst performing Republican presidential candidate. That was Bob Dole in 1996. So this is a key voting bloc, especially in battleground states, because they can make a difference in 2020. They can be the difference between some place like Florida going for President Trump or former Vice President Joe Biden. The reality is that Latinos are not a monolith. They don't vote all the same way, right? Cuban Americans, Puerto Ricans, Mexicans, other types of people from South America, they all have different reasons why they pick their candidates. And the reality is that for a lot of them, they're conservative and they support President Trump.
It's so fascinating. The Pew Research Group did an interesting study of Florida in the wake of the 2016 election. They saw that a significant share of Cubans in Florida did vote for Hillary Clinton, about 41%, but this was far below the 71% of non-Cuban Latinos who backed Hillary Clinton. And at the same time, the level of support for Trump among Cubans was similar to that of non-Latinos in the state, about 51%. What do those numbers tell you?
Yeah, so Cuban Americans specifically in Florida, like we know, this is like a key constituency in the Republican Party, and they have been about since the Reagan era. So for a lot of them, they align with a lot of this free enterprise, anti-socialism rhetoric of the Republican Party. They've been a key constituency for so long that at this point doesn't really matter who the candidate is. They're gonna support the Republican Party because they believe in those values, right? A lot of them are pro-life. A lot of them, believe in capitalism. A lot of them are small business owners. Right now, we're seeing a little bit of a break among generations, and that has been reported by other outlets where younger Cuban Americans might be more willing to support Democratic candidates, but it's still a ton of Cuban Americans vote aligned with, white Republicans.
Interesting. Tell us more. Let's talk about the stereotypes of Latinos that vote for Republicans. And you point out in your reporting that Cubans and Catholic Latino groups are often associated with Republicans. And explain to our viewers what your reporting uncovered as to the reasons why.
Yeah, so the first group to actually support, the first Latino group that supported Republicans was Latinos with Eisenhower back in, the mid-20th century. And this was in California, and this was actually a group created by Mexicans. So even though we think Cubans and Catholics specifically as the two groups that are more likely to support the Republican Party among Latinos, the reality is that this is a really diverse group of people, right? About 8 million Latinos are going to vote in California this election season, and about 2 million of them identify as Republican. And a lot of them are Mexican American and from other groups as well, right? Another key fact that you need to know is that a ton of Latinos are actually evangelical. They're not as Catholic as they were before. And this is another reason why they're more likely to vote Republican, because their evangelical churches are actually mobilizing them, right? They're a little bit more politicized in that sense than the Catholic Church at this point. So even though in the imaginary, a Republican Latino is like a Cuba in Miami, that's not accurate when you think about like the millions and millions of Latinos from other ethnic groups that live across the country and that also support the Republican Party.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's always an assumption that specifically when the GOP is talking about the Latino vote, they do mean those that you referenced. It is intriguing, too, about the evangelical support, given the personal behavior of President Trump versus the personal behavior of, for example, Vice President Biden, who's a staunch Catholic, who's a church-going member of the faith, who goes to church every Sunday. It seems that that doesn't matter as much as, for example, putting conservative judges onto benches, which would galvanize evangelical Latino voters.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think this is one of the main reasons why the name Barbara Lagoa, this judge, was floated last week as a possible replacement for Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg after she passed. And it was because a lot of Latinos actually care about the Supreme Court, right? They actually care about abortion. They actually care about healthcare and like the possibility of having yet another conservative justice. Obviously, the president is nominating Amy Coney Barrett for this position, but it was appealing for a second there. And a lot of like Florida Republicans were really pushing for Barbara Lagoa to take this role because they thought that it could mobilize Latino voters in Florida who are going to be, as we talked earlier, like a key constituency come November, or already, actually.
Did you uncover in your reporting that there are certain Latinos who support President Trump that have to deal with negative things that are said about the country of their parents' birth or their ancestors?
Yeah, and I think, like every other minority group who supports President Trump, they kind of rationalize it a little bit. I spoke with a woman, for example, whose parents are immigrants from Mexico, and, she had family from El Salvador, which the president has reportedly called S country, because I'm not going to repeat that word. And she kind of said, when he talks about that, he's kind of right. Like, this is a country that's poor. This is a country that, has long time issues. About Mexico, she said, yeah, like, a lot of Mexican immigrants, I think that they're not the best when they cross the border. So they kind of rationalize it. And in some ways, when the president speaks, they also say, like, he's an unpresidential president. Like, despite his rhetoric, he cares about the community. One selling point for the Trump campaign throughout this election was that there was record unemployment among Latinos. There was like a record number of people who became homeowners. And, his rhetoric was like, despite what I might say, I'm still serving you and my policies are still like working for you. So therefore, you should support me. And for some Latino voters, like that message is actually, pretty compelling, and they're willing to look away from some of the rhetoric he has and said, despite everything, his administration is working for me, therefore I'm going to vote for him.
Let me dig a little deeper into that, because I find that fascinating. And I come from a family of immigrants from both the Caribbean, Europe, Asia. It strikes me that oftentimes there's an opportunity to look beyond just the country of origin and perhaps also consider class. You made some interesting points there about homeowners. I mean, there is a huge difference, and I've seen it in my own family as a reference point, of people who are privileged in the very first place. I mean, even if we think about people who are migrants, the opportunity, the ability to get from your country of origin to the United States and actually start to work and to, provide for your family is already a step above oftentimes other people who are unable to be afforded that privilege. And as you climb up that economic ladder, you start to see things differently from those people who are still downtrodden, even if they may have come from your own country of origin. Did you find a little bit of that, that if you are a wealthy immigrant or first-generation immigrant from a country that the president has called an S-hole country, you may actually, in some weird way, relate to what he is saying when it comes to that derogatory remark?
Yeah, I cannot speak specifically to immigrants, but Latinos in general, when you look at the groups within the Latino community who support the president, they are usually men. men without college degrees, and affluent voters. So yeah, definitely class and socioeconomic status plays a role in the way that Latinos may choose to support the Republican Party, right? Like they favor a lot of their economic policies because they see themselves as, pulling themselves up by the bootstraps, and this idea that when you migrate, like this is the American dream, and if you are able to achieve that if you work hard enough, and if you don't achieve that, it's because you're not working hard enough. And that type of rhetoric definitely, like, it's ingrained in a lot of Latino families and a lot of Latino voters who view their own success and their own economic well-being as a product of their own hard work, instead of just, taking in consideration that there's a lot of factors that play into whether you're able to succeed in this country or not.
That's an excellent point. I have two more questions for you before we wrap this up. Just give me a brief understanding of how President Trump is able to capitalize on strategies that were employed by President Reagan and President Bush to court their vote.
Yeah, so these are two presidents that, for example, appointed or nominated Latinos to high positions within the administration, right? Reagan nominated the first Latino cabinet secretary in history. It was Secretary of Education. So this is a signal to a lot of Latino voters that you are part of our administration. We care about you. Look at, you're represented in this way. And this is a tactic that has been employed by previous presidents before. So that's why, for example, the potential nomination of Barbara Lagoa was so publicized, because it was a signal to Latino voters, if she was nominated, that they were part of the administration, that President Trump had them in mind.
And finally, this is a fascinating question. The future of Puerto Rico, as you know, is up for debate. Congresswoman Nadia Velázquez and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez introduced a bill to Congress to give Puerto Rico the decision on statehood. It's also on the ballot in Puerto Rico this November. Mm-hmm. Why has Puerto Rico's statehood caused such a divide in Congress? And what kind of progress can you expect from either candidate should either President Trump be reelected or Vice President Biden win the election?
Yeah, President Trump in 2016 said, what typically U.S. Candidates and presidents say, which is we're going to leave the people of Puerto Rico, this decision up to the people of Puerto Rico. They're going to decide, and whatever they decide, I'm going to be cool with it. Then in 2018, after Hurricane Maria and all this pushback from local leaders who felt that the administration was not doing enough, he was like, I don't want Puerto Rico to be a state unless, they clean house, and I don't have many critics there. Vice President Biden, what has said is that he will support whatever Puerto Ricans decide, and that he personally supports statehood, which has been in the DNC platform since around 2012. So that's pretty typical. The reality is that a lot of Republicans have been pushing against the idea of Puerto Rican statehood, because they believe that if Puerto Rico was to become a state, it would automatically send 2 Democratic senators. But the reality is that Puerto Rico is a little bit more complicated than that. It's still a very conservative place, and in my personal opinion, as a Puerto Rican myself and someone who reports on the island, I think Puerto Rico would probably be a swing state. It'd probably be either a purple state or someplace like West Virginia, who would send a very conservative Democratic senator. But a lot of Republicans, it's easier to say, we don't want Puerto Rico to be a state because it would add 2 Democratic seats to the Senate, and that's kind of a scary tactic for a lot of people. So Puerto Rico has had how many referendums at this point? Maybe 6 or 7, in which the question of the status has been posed to the Puerto Rican people. This have been kind of expensive surveys that are not binding, and Congress has not said, whatever they decide, we're going to take it into account. So we'll see what happens. I do not expect much to change after November, to be quite honest.
It's such a good point that you make again, speaking of the stereotypes, that Republicans just blanket believe that if Puerto Rico were to be a state, that somehow they would fall into the Democratic bracket, when you say it's much more nuanced than that, as most discussions around politics, and especially around issues like this, are. Mm-hmm. President Trump called Puerto Rico he once called it the most corrupt place on earth, but then he announced that billion-dollar aid package and went on to say, we've done more for Puerto Rico than anybody. Do Puerto Ricans believe that?
I think that there's a section of Puerto Ricans that actually believe that. You'd be surprised how many Trump supporters are in the island, even though people in the island cannot vote in federal elections. And, again, this was a tactic to kind of like get Puerto Rican voters in Florida. They make about 1/3 of the Latino constituency there. And in 2018, Puerto Ricans helped send former Governor Rick Scott to the Senate, who is a Republican. So it could as well just work out if the Biden campaign doesn't do much to try to get the Boricua vote out.
Fascinating reporting. Andrea González-Ramírez, thank you so much for spending some time with us. Really important stuff.
Thank you.